Okay, so succinctly summarised, your argument is that once China grew wealthy as a result of Western engagement, particularly US engagement in the 1990s and the 2000s, that a US-China great power competition was inevitable. And had US policymakers understood the realist logic, your logic, John, of great power conflict in the early 1990s, they would have tried to slow down Chinese growth and maximise the power gap between Beijing and Washington. That's your line, right?
That's exactly right, Tom. And the fact is, as you well know, in the early 1990s, most people thought that realism was dead, or that balance of power politics was dead. Great power war was off the table forever, and that people like me were dinosaurs. So when I made the argument loudly and clearly starting in early 2001 that we were in trouble and we should do what we can to slow down China, nobody wanted to hear that argument.
Okay, so instead of fostering harmonious relations between China and the US, as the conventional wisdom said it would in the 1990s and 2000s, all engagements done is led to this intense security competition. The question here is, what course then should have been conducted, and how would that have changed where we are now?
Well, it's very important to understand that in 1990, China was a backward country economically. It had 1/75th the per capita GNP of the United States. And per capita GNP is a really good indicator of just how wealthy a country is. So this was a backward country, but it was deeply committed to growing economically, to becoming prosperous. So the question is, what should the United States do? A good realist like me would say that it's obvious that what the United States should do is do everything possible to slow down Chinese economic growth. And here we're talking about the fact that China depended on U.S. Markets, U.S. technology, and U.S. capability to grow. And with regard to those markets, we should have gone to great lengths to slow down trade with China, to not give them any special deals, which we did do. We certainly should have not welcomed them into the WTO. And as far as technology is concerned, we should have gone to great lengths to prevent technology transfers to China. And we should have gone to great lengths to limit foreign direct investment in China. And we did none of those things. And in fact, we did the opposite.
And the result is we're now in deep trouble, you say, and there is little we can do to change the situation. Tell us more.
Look, the fact is, Tom, from Beijing's point of view, it makes eminently good sense to want to dominate Asia, just the way the United States dominates the Western Hemisphere. The Chinese have no interest in having the Americans in their backyard any more than we, the United States, have an interest in having China in our backyard. That's why we have the Monroe Doctrine. So once you take a country with that large a population and you make it really wealthy, it is going to have the wherewithal to take efforts or to take measures to try to dominate its region of the world. And of course, the United States is going to try to prevent that. So what we did was we created a situation where China was powerful enough, or is powerful enough, to try to dominate Asia.
You make the point, obviously, that as a result of all this, Washington and Beijing will now wage a very intense security competition that can best be managed on the margins to prevent disaster. We'll get to that later on, but let's test your thesis and go back to the 1990s, John. Of course, this is the time of the end of the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union. Charles Krauthammer coined the unipolar moment to describe an era of US primacy in the international system. Our old friend Frank Fukuyama, the end of history, all of that. And there was a bipartisan consensus, a very strong bipartisan consensus in Washington, in Canberra, indeed most of the West, that believed that we needed to integrate China into the global economy, and this was a view held by liberals as well as conservatives on left and right of the political spectrum. And of course, at the time, this was a tremendous economic opportunity that China presented to the West. The question here is, what did the widespread rejection of everything you've been saying of strategic realism, what did the widespread rejection of realism tell us about Western public discourse during the 1990s and the 2000s?
I think there are 2 points here. The first is, I think that the Frank Fukuyama view of the world won out once the Cold War ended. People in the West believe that the United States and its allies had fought fascism in the first half of the 20th century and defeated it. And then in the second half, we, mainly in the West here, and this would include countries like Japan and Australia as part of the West, I'm using that term loosely, that we had defeated communism. And what the future held in store was nothing but liberal democracy. As time went by, more and more countries would become liberal democracies. To put it in slightly different terms, we had the wind at our back. And people like me who argued that realism was still alive, great power politics would still matter in the future, were seen as dinosaurs, people who had an outdated view of international politics. So the fact is, Tom, there was absolutely no chance, given how people were thinking at the time, that we could sell an argument that it made sense to slow down Chinese economic growth. And in fact, most people believed that if China grew economically, it would eventually become a liberal democracy. And because liberal democracies don't engage in violations of human rights, and because liberal democracies don't fight each other, once China was a liberal democracy, we would all live happily ever after. This is the story that people told themselves.
Yeah, we told that at CIS. We're a classical liberal think tank. We subscribe to that orthodoxy too. In fact, we were unashamedly championing it.
No, of course, that's true. I think, by the way, that you basically thought my views didn't make a lot of sense in the early 2000s when you first heard them. And I think that was true of most people.
But see, a lot of people listening into this would say, quite rightly, if we followed your approach in the 1990s and the 2000s, what effect would have that had on the economies of the US, Australia, Japan, and other countries that engaged heavily with China? That would have hurt us, surely, economically.
Well, first of all, with regard to China, it would have delayed for a long time the point at which China became a great power. Remember, during the Cold War, China was not a great power. We lived in a bipolar world. There were two great powers on the planet, the United States and the Soviet Union. So China was not a great power in 1990. It would have taken much longer than it has for China to become a great power. And furthermore, I believe once it became a great power, let's say that happened in 2025 or 2030, that great power would have been much weaker than the one that we're facing today. So we could have slowed down Chinese economic growth and delayed its achievement of great power status, okay? Now, your point is that the United States and Australia and Japan would have suffered as a result of this. I think there is some truth in that. There is no doubt that we would not be as prosperous today as we are, but we would not have suffered as much as China did. And the relative power gap, which is of enormous importance, the relative power gap would have been much more favorable for the United States, for Australia, and for Japan. And that matters greatly. We would not have created, Tom, a peer competitor.
Yep. And your argument is that essentially in the 90s and 2000s, we in the West were feeding the beast. I get that. But let's return to 2021 and that beast. You argue in Foreign Affairs magazine, quote, "This Sino-American rivalry will test US policymakers more than the original Cold War did, as China is likely to be a more powerful competitor than the Soviet Union in its prime." That's what you say in Foreign Affairs magazine. But let me put this to you, John. The Soviet Union was physically located in Europe and East Asia, and directly adjacent to the Persian Gulf,